This story takes place nearly 175 years ago. This was a time in America when crime went unpunished for most victims. Whether being eaten by wildlife or being executed for your property, there were some fates that were worse than death. Let's begin. 1850 in the country of the United States was a cowboy by the name of Donnie. Somewhere in a rural, isolated part of Kentucky, Donnie owned and operated a large animal farm which he maintained cows and sheep. He got married and had 3 daughters and a son by his wife. The cattle grazing work was most difficult and done by Donnie and his 10-year-old son, whose name was Poe. Over the past several months, Donnie had lost a total of 6 lambs due to coyote attacks. During each attack, Donnie held Poe responsible because whenever Donnie would leave the farm, Poe would sneak off to meet a young girl that he was interested in. During those times of sneaking off, he managed to lose an animal. In each case, his father didn't find out about the missing animal until days later. This only happened when the smell of rotting carcasses was so strong that it led them to each animal that was carried off and partially consumed. For the record, the smell of death is said to be a unique smell. Most people who had the unfortunate opportunity to experience it never tend to forget and can identify that smell months or even years after their initial exposure. One day, Donnie had to leave the farm in Poe's hands again. When he returned, he came back to see that all his animals were accounted for, so Donnie was proud of Poe. It wasn't until 4 days later, on a very windy day, is when the stench of death could be smelled as soon as Donnie's wife opened their front door to the house. His wife had immediately become sick, which caused her to dry heave, nearly vomiting on the house floor. Hearing his wife in trouble, Donnie panicked and ran to help his wife, who he believed was in danger. When he reached her, he saw that she was sick but was okay. Donnie immediately took his attention off his wife and discovered what was making her sick. The wind, which was blowing hard this particular day, was being blown across the field, coming from where the property line was and where the fence post stood. Without any proof, Donnie immediately became angry and believed that Poe had allowed another one of his animals to be consumed by a bear when he was supposed to be watching them. Johnny grabbed his rifle and began to walk in the direction of the smell, which passed his property line. After climbing under his fence and now walking through the woods for about 40 yards, Donnie stumbled upon an abandoned campsite with an extinguished campfire. On the other side of the campfire was a body of a man, which is where the smell was emanating from. Donnie returned back to the farm and told his wife, then he went to get the local sheriff. The sheriff returned with Donnie and investigated the scene. The sheriff was a tall, slim man with an arrogant attitude. This was probably due to his position that he held, and his knowledge about everything that goes on within his jurisdiction made him feel very powerful. The sheriff stood over the victim, took out a small sack of tobacco, pulled out a wad, and then stuffed it into his mouth. Donnie stood there, dumbfounded, waiting for the sheriff to say something, anything. The sheriff started by saying that the deceased male victim wasn't a local resident. He looked to be in his late 20s, and both victims' pistols were missing from his holster, and he was found to be missing a leg. Initially, the sheriff assumed that the man's leg had been consumed by a wild animal, but after taking a closer look, he realized that the leg had been clearly sliced off evenly, straight through the leg. The sheriff found some documents on the man and notified his deputy to have someone return to bury the body. Later that day, the sheriff learned that the man was a wanted cattle thief from the victim's identifying document. The deceased man was also believed to be part of a gang that was committing crimes all throughout the neighboring counties. The sheriff joked about the man being deserving of his fate. He also stated that he heard stories about a cannibal that lived in the woods and occasionally ate people. The sheriff told Donnie about several reports of cannibalism from various bordering states, so he and his family needed to be careful. Since the victim's leg was clearly cut off and removed from the scene, albeit far-fetched, maybe this was also a possibility. Donnie believed that the sheriff's posture regarding this case showed that he wasn't interested in investigating a deceased criminal. 3 months prior, a young man that came from a 2-parent, financially stable home by the name of Levi became fascinated with the outlaw fast life. As a juvenile, Levi committed petty crimes just for fun. He didn't need the money because his parents took care of him, but he stole any and everything he could from locals. Levi would taunt the sheriff to chase him. When he was eventually apprehended, he took his beating from the deputies like a man. When it came time for sentencing, he cursed out the judge with every derogatory name that he could think of with his limited schooling. The judge would try scaring him by giving Levi jail time within the sheriff's department, but he was unbothered. Levi would escape from jail one evening to chase his dream of being an outlaw. Levi had a little cousin named Littleberry that lived over an hour away, so he chose to go there and hide out at his home until morning. Since they were little kids, he and Littleberry would fantasize about running away to California to join some random ruthless gang. The next morning, Levi asked Littleberry to come outside with him so that they can talk about something. They both climbed out the window and walked about 100 yards or so away from the home where Levi asked Littleberry to run away with him to California. Littleberry was concerned that Levi had not thought this whole thing out. Levi was already on the run from the authorities. Littleberry thought, what if Levi was captured and he would be all alone? He also mentioned that they had no idea where they would rest, how they would get money or eat for that matter during their several months of journey to California. Because Levi was unable to give any concrete answers to Littleberry, he became very agitated and annoyed with him. Levi reassured Littleberry several times that things would just work itself out, but he should just trust him so that they can leave together. Littleberry respectfully refused and chose to start marching home because Levi seemed to become progressively enraged. Levi felt abandoned by Littleberry, so he called him a traitor. Littleberry continues to march in silence in order to not agitate Levi any further. Since Levi was much bigger in size than Littleberry, he ran behind him and threw him to the ground. That's when Levi pulled out a large hunting knife and plunged it into his chest. Levi allegedly began to cry tears because he had only meant to scare him, but he let his anger get the best of him. Immediately after, Levi fled by horseback. Days later, after finding the deceased Littleberry's body, family and friends knew that Levy was involved, and they formed a hunting party in which they actually captured Levy and turned him over to the sheriff. Because Levi seemed sincerely distraught over the loss of his cousin, the judge had shown him leniency and sentenced him to an insane asylum in lieu of execution. Over the next 13 years, the local sheriff continued to hear stories about dozens of people being cannibalized in various states. The sheriff didn't concern himself about anything other than his jurisdiction, but he was surprised that it was happening. The only explanation that he could think of was that the native Indians were savages. Between them killing every man, woman, and child they encountered, it just seems to make sense that they would eat some of their own victims. The trail of deceased victims went through several states, but the only ones actually confirmed were Texas, Utah, California, and Oregon. Several weeks later, a team of 6 ruthless outlaws were terrorizing, robbing, and executing their victims to avoid apprehension. This included a tribe of Native Americans. Those natives took chase after the outlaws for harming one of their own. One by one, the outlaws were being deleted by the Indians. The leader of the gang, by the name of Burton, who was responsible for dozens of deletions, also taught his gang everything they knew, such as seeking victims to rob, how to survive on the run, and evading the authorities. Because these Indians were a different type of enemy, Burton was fearful of being caught and tortured to death by the Indians they attacked. They demanded that they continue to run until they reached Fort Hall, which at the time was a military outpost. The Indians were exceptional trackers. They would hunt the outlaws down, engage in fighting, and then eliminate a few of the outlaw members as the survivors escaped. This prevented the outlaws from hunting for food, so after a few days they ran out of food. During the chase, the outlaws were starving, so they couldn't help but to talk about food or eating constantly. One of the members secretly went up to Burton and suggested that they sacrifice one of the members for food. Burton refused the suggestion and then became disgusted with the idea. To make sure that his men did not share his idea, he reassured his men that if they were to hold out until they reached the military outpost, there would be enough food for them to eat. As the days passed, one by one, all of the members except 2 were either captured or deleted. During the last battle between the Indians, Burton was injured. Burton was helped escape by the last remaining outlaw, and they hid in the woods. Burton knew that the Indians would not stop until every last one of them were either captured or deleted. Being fearful of being tortured until his deletion, he stated that he would unalive himself before being captured. He instructed the last remaining outlaw to leave him behind and save himself. Before leaving, Burton asked the young man what made him suggest to cannibalize one of the gang members so that the others would survive. Had he eaten anyone before? The young man stated that during his travels he had eaten many of people in the past in order to survive, and even preferred the taste over beef. Burton looked back at the young man with amazement. The young man happened to be Levi Boone Helm. Levi had escaped from the insane asylum over 14 years ago and was on the run from the authorities throughout the country ever since. Levi had left Burton to his fate and began walking away through the woods. When Levi heard the one fatal gunshot, he returned to where Burton was left and found that he had unalived himself. Levi cut off both of Burton's legs. He made a campfire and cooked one leg. Levi then took the second leg, wrapped it up, and took it with him on his journey. Levi eventually escaped the Indians and joined the Henry Plummer gang, which was in the state of Montana. Eventually, the entire gang was deleted except for 5 members that were apprehended by the authority. One of the survivors was Levi. He began to confess all of his crimes. Many of them included over a dozen of deletions he personally committed. He was unable to remember the total amount of victims because he constantly moved from state to state and lost track of the numbers. Levi cannibalized many of them in order to evade apprehension, which allowed him to survive in the wilderness for long periods of time. Levi and his colleagues were all executed for their crime.